For more than 100 years, a sound filled 7 floors of marble in the middle of Philadelphia, twice a day, every day but Sunday. It came from the largest playing pipe organ in the world, more than 28,000 pipes. The smallest is the size of a pencil. The largest stands taller than a house. Almost none of them are ever seen because they sit behind a plain white door in what used to be the women's clothing department. In the spring of 2025, the sound stopped. The store around it had closed. Its shoppers were gone. And the organ fell silent in an empty hall, inside a building that most people now walk past without looking up. The man who put it there was born poor. He was judged too sick to fight in his own country's war. He sold his first suits out of a single room. By the end of his life, he was worth around $100 million. He had served in a president's cabinet, and he had built a store so large it covered an entire city block in Philadelphia. I went looking for a story about a shop. What turned up instead was a man who spent 60 years building things meant to outlast him, and then lived to watch a strange amount of it burn. This is the story of John Wanamaker, the brickmaker's son who taught a country how to shop. He talked his way into the highest circle of power in America and was accused of buying his place there. He raised 2 sons. One poured a fortune into the dream of crossing the Atlantic by air. The other set out to photograph a people he was sure would soon be gone. And one by one, the things he built slipped away from him. Some of it burned. The rest he simply outlived. It begins with a boy nobody bet on. The brickmaker's son. The United States Army did not want him. In 1861, with the country tearing itself in two, John Wanamaker tried to enlist. He was turned away. His chest was weak, his cough would not leave him, and the recruiters decided he would not last a season in the field. He was 22 years old, and the war that shaped his whole generation would be fought without him. So he went and did the one thing he already knew how to do. He sold things. He had been born on July 11, 1838, in Gray's Ferry, a working district on the southern edge of Philadelphia. His father, Nelson, made bricks. His mother, Elizabeth, was an innkeeper's daughter. There was no money standing behind the family and no name that opened any doors. When John was still a boy, his grandfather went chasing cheaper work out in Indiana, and the rest of them followed. The move failed. They were back in Philadelphia within a few years, and by then his schooling had ended for good. He had finished, by most accounts, around 3 years of formal education in his entire life. There is a stubbornness in the young Wanamaker that I think explains nearly everything that came after. A boy with that little schooling and a bad chest had every reason to keep his head down and his hopes small. He went the other way entirely. At 14, he took a job as an errand boy in a bookshop, earning a little over $1 a week. Better pay soon pulled him to a clothing store, and then to the finest men's shop in the city. There he started out polishing the brass on the doors and worked his way up onto the sales floor. In 1857, he fell seriously ill and traveled west, not chasing work this time, but trying to save his own health. When he came home, a different kind of work was waiting. The Young Men's Christian Association in Philadelphia took him on as its first paid secretary at a salary that was generous for the day. He proved worth every dollar of it. In a single year, the membership climbed from 57 men to more than 2,000. He gave away New Testaments by the hundred and drew pledges of sobriety from men who had never once thought to make one. For Wanamaker, religion was never a quiet thing kept for Sundays. It was the engine under everything. In 1859, he opened a Sunday school of his own in a rented room on South Street. The neighbors wanted no part of it. On the very first morning, a crowd drove him, his 2 teachers, and all 27 of his students out into the street. He simply found another building further down the road and began again. That school, which he named Bethany, would grow over the following decades into the largest Sunday school in the country. None of this looked anything like the start of an empire, and yet the certainty was already there in him. The plain sense that he was built for something far larger than the life he had been handed. He prayed over it. He also, very quietly, began to plan. The plans came together in 1861. Wanamaker put his savings alongside those of a young man named Nathan Brown, who had married into his family and become his brother-in-law. The two of them opened a men's clothing store at 6th and Market Streets, only steps from the house where George Washington had lived as president. They called it Oak Hall. From its first day, the store ran on a rule that sounds obvious now and was close to radical then. One price, marked plainly on the goods, the same for every person who came through the door. No haggling. The sharp customer got no clever discount, and the nervous one paid no quiet penalty. Buy something. Decide you did not want it, and you could bring it back for your money. The idea came straight out of his faith. He believed that if every soul stood equal before God, then every customer ought to stand equal before a price tag. A widow with no taste for bargaining would pay exactly what a banker paid. It was sound religion. It also turned out to be very sound business. Oak Hall grew quickly. The store stitched uniforms through the war years and sold to a city crowded with soldiers and their families. Within a decade, it had become, by most accounts, the largest men's clothing business in the country. Then Nathan Brown died young. Wanamaker, on his own now and carrying a name that customers had begun to trust, put that name up over the door, and the firm became John Wanamaker and Company. He was barely past 30. He had money now, and a young family. And he was privately sure that selling shirts was only ever going to be the start of it. He had watched how people moved through a store, and what made them linger and spend. And he had decided to do something with all of it that no merchant in Philadelphia had dared to try. He was going to buy himself a train station. The Grand Depot. The building had started life as a railroad freight depot, long and low, and by the middle of the 1870s it sat empty at the corner of 13th and Market, a dead shed in a growing city. John Wanamaker bought it. Most of Philadelphia thought he had lost his mind. He was a clothing man. He had never run a grocery counter or a furniture hall in his life, and now he meant to run both, and a dozen trades besides. The money was pouring into a derelict shed, on a stretch of Market Street the carriage trade had not yet found. The careful bet was that it would fail. He did not want the building for the trains, he wanted the floor. A freight depot is one enormous open room, and where other merchants saw a problem, Wanamaker saw something no shop in the city could match. Space. Enough of it to put everything a household might need under a single roof in one building on one visit. That was the idea that would make him. Not a clothing store. Not a dry goods shop. A place where a family could buy a coat, a chair, a clock, and a pound of coffee without once stepping back onto the street. The thing did not really have a name yet. In time, people would call it a department store. He also had a sense of timing that bordered on luck. In the spring of 1876, the whole country was about to descend on Philadelphia. The city was hosting the Centennial Exhibition, a World's Fair marking 100 years of American independence, and visitors would arrive in the millions. Wanamaker opened his doors days before the fair did. He called the place the Grand Depot. The crowds came and they did not stop. By one count, 71,000 people came through on the opening day alone. A number I first took for a misprint. 71,000 in a single day, in a city of under 1 million. The Centennial visitors found their way to his counters by the thousand, and a great many of them went home having bought something. The store was built to be walked through and gawked at. Long curving rows of counters ran out from the center of the room. A customer could stand in the middle and watch the aisles stretch away on every side. Inside, the Grand Depot worked unlike anything they had seen. Goods were laid out by kind, each in its own section, and a shopper could wander for an hour without a clerk pressing in. Within a few years, the store held close to 50 separate departments. First came the women's clothing. Furniture and books followed close behind. Before long, there was a whole department selling nothing but pianos. It also did something quieter that mattered just as much. It gave women a place to be. A respectable middle-class woman in the 1870s had few public rooms she could enter on her own without comment. Wanamaker's store was one of them. She could spend a whole afternoon inside it, and no one would think a thing of it. Then he began reaching for things the rest of the trade had not even considered. In 1878, while most of Philadelphia still lit its evenings with gas, he ran electric light through the Grand Depot. It was among the first stores anywhere to glow from the inside after dark. The next year he put in a telephone, one of the first to ring in any store in the country, and by 1880, money no longer crossed the floor by hand. He had laid in a network of pneumatic tubes, so a clerk could send a payment whooshing through a brass pipe to a central desk and back. The comforts were just as deliberate. He opened a restaurant inside the store, said to be the first of its kind in an American shop, so that no one need leave to eat. His own buyers crossed the ocean to bring back goods the city had never seen on a shelf. And the slow weeks of winter handed him one more idea. He marked down his linens and white goods and called it a white sale. It was the first of its name, a way to keep customers coming when nothing else would. Each of these, on its own, was a small thing. Together, they remade what a store could be. Shopping stopped being a chore you hurried through and became something closer to an outing, a thing a family might do on a free afternoon for its own sake. What Wanamaker grasped, earlier than almost anyone, was that the building itself could sell. He gave people light to see by and warmth against the cold, a place to eat and a place to sit, reasons to stay, and when people stayed, they spent. But a store is not only its walls and its wiring. It is the people who stand behind the counters, and the words that pull strangers in off the street in the first place. On both of those, Wanamaker was about to break every rule the trade still lived by. The empire behind the counter. To work behind a counter at Wanamaker's was to be looked after in ways almost no other worker in America could expect. He paid for his people's doctors. Inside the company, he built a school, the Commercial Institute, so that the youngest clerks could keep learning instead of stopping at whatever grade their families could afford. A pension waited for those who grew old in his service. In good years, he shared out a portion of the profits. His workers had a company band and ball teams of their own. Their children were sent on summer outings. Those who wanted to better themselves could sit in evening classes or borrow from the store's own library. Most of this arrived a full generation before such things were common anywhere in American business. Wanamaker did not think of his store as a place that merely employed people. He thought of it as something closer to a family, with himself at its head. It was generous. It was also total. The man who paid his clerks' medical bills expected their complete loyalty in return, and on one matter he would not bend. Unions. In 1887, when the Knights of Labor tried to organize his workers, Wanamaker did not argue and did not negotiate. He set his store detectives loose on the problem. They found the first dozen employees who had signed on, and he turned every one of them out. The lesson reached everyone who stayed. You could take his generosity. You could not take a stand against him. Two things were true of the man at once, and I have given up trying to choose between them. By the standard of his day, he was about as generous an employer as America had. He was also a man who would put detectives on his own staff and throw a dozen of them into the street for the offense of joining a union. If the people behind the counter were one half of his empire, the other half was whatever it was that brought strangers to that counter in the first place. Advertising. And here, more than anywhere else, he changed how selling was done. He believed in advertising completely, and he backed that belief with money no merchant had risked before. Where rivals bought a column, Wanamaker bought the page. In 1874, he ran the first half-page newspaper advertisement anyone had published. 5 years later, he ran the first full-page one. By 1888, he was buying a full page on a fixed schedule, week after week, a sum that would have frightened most men in the trade. What set his advertising apart was not only the size of it, it was the honesty. He insisted that his ads tell the truth, even when the truth did not flatter the goods, on the simple theory that a customer who trusted the words would come back to read the next ones. And being a devout man, he would not advertise at all on a Sunday. It was a slow way to grow and a sure one. Trust, once earned, brought the same families back season after season. In 1880, he hired a former journalist named John Emery Powers and made him what advertising histories still call the first full-time copywriter in the world. Powers wrote in short, plain sentences, stripped of flourish, copy that read less like a sales pitch and more like the store talking honestly to you across a counter. It worked like nothing before it. Told to clear out a heap of cheap, unsold rain capes, the flimsy kind people called gossamers, Powers wrote a single flat line. It admitted plainly that the store had a pile of these gossamers and simply wanted them gone. By noon the next day, every last one had sold. The two men did not get along. Wanamaker once called Powers the most impudent man he had ever laid eyes on, and Powers, for his part, refused to soften a single word he believed was true. Wanamaker fired him, then thought better of it and hired him back. It did not last. But across the years Powers wrote for the store, its yearly sales doubled, climbing from around $4 million to $8 million, a true fortune for the time. Powers left his mark far past the store. A later generation of advertising men like to say there were only two kinds of advertising, the Powers kind and all the rest. And yet, even Wanamaker could never quite explain his own success. He is said to have remarked that half the money he spent on advertising was wasted. The trouble was, he never knew which half. By the 1880s, John Wanamaker had won. The poor boy from Gray's Ferry was a rich and famous man now. His name spelled across the biggest store in the city, and his advertising spread through every newspaper in it. There was just one thing left that all his money could not openly buy: real political power. And in 1888, he set out to buy it anyway. The man who bought the post office. John Wanamaker did not run for public office. He paid his way into it. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison was running for president, and a campaign needs two things above all: votes and money. Wanamaker could not hand Harrison the votes. The money was another matter. He took charge of raising the funds, and he did it at a scale that startled the men around him. He gathered a war chest larger than the party had ever assembled. Much of it came from the businessmen of the East, who wanted a Republican in the White House, and a high tariff to guard their trade. Wanamaker gave a great deal of his own money on top of it, and he was handed something close to a free hand over how all of it was spent. Nobody put the rest of the arrangement in writing. Nobody had to. A man who raised that kind of money for a winning candidate expected to be remembered, and Harrison was not the sort to forget. When the votes were counted, Harrison had won. What came next surprised no one who had watched the bargain take shape. In 1889, the new president named John Wanamaker his postmaster general, a seat in the cabinet of the United States. A merchant who had never held any office in his life now ran what was then the largest part of the federal government. The country drew the obvious conclusion: he had bought it. The New York Times greeted the appointment by dismissing him as a clever and unscrupulous advertiser, and little more. The charge trailed him for the rest of his public life, and it was not hard to see where it came from. There was more to it than reward, though. Wanamaker wanted the office. A religious man who had spent his life mixing trade with good works, he liked the idea of public service. He wanted to be more than a shopkeeper who had gotten rich. The cabinet made him a statesman, at least on paper. This is not a partisan smear. It is simply what he did next. Wanamaker reached the post office and began clearing it out. Under the old spoils system, a change of party meant a change of staff, and he applied the rule without mercy. He pushed out the postal workers who had been hired under the Democrats, by some accounts as many as 30,000 of them, and handed their jobs to Republicans. The result was confusion. Mail went missing. In some towns, the post office simply stopped working for weeks. Clerks who knew the job were swapped overnight for men who did not, and it dragged him into a long, bitter quarrel with a young reformer in his own party, a man named Theodore Roosevelt, who held that government jobs should go to the able and not the connected. Roosevelt thought him a disgrace, and said so more than once. And here the man refuses to stay simple. The same postmaster who stripped his department for patronage also turned out to be a real reformer, more effective than most of the honest men who had held the job. He drew up the first serious plan for free rural delivery. For millions of farm families, the post office was a building in a town they might reach once a week, if the weather held, and a letter could sit there for days waiting to be fetched. Wanamaker wanted the mail carried out to them instead, to a box at the end of the lane. The plan cost too much to pass in his own term, but it did not die with him. It became law a few years after he left, and it reached into the daily life of rural America for good. Then there was the lottery. The Louisiana lottery was a national scandal in its own right. It was a private company that had bought its way into a state's constitution, and it sold tickets in every corner of the country through the mail. In 1890, Wanamaker pushed Congress to bar lottery tickets from the United States mail, and then he hunted the lottery companies through the courts as hard as he had ever chased a sale. Without the mail to carry it, the great lottery could not survive. It collapsed. If you had asked me, before I read this, whether the man who bought his way into the cabinet was also the man who broke the American lottery, I would have guessed wrong. He did exactly that. No state would run a legal lottery again for more than 70 years. This was the pattern of him, and it only grew clearer with the years. He took an office in a way that looked corrupt, and then he used it better than cleaner men had. He had bought his place in the cabinet, and then he had made it count. But buying an appointment was one thing. The two prizes he wanted most after this, the respect of the public, and an office won by honest votes, were not for sale at any price. He would spend the next 10 years learning that, the hard way. The one thing he could not buy. The wife of the President of the United States was given a house. It was a summer cottage by the sea at Cape May Point on the New Jersey shore, a gift in the summer of 1890 from a group of wealthy Philadelphians. At the head of them stood the President's own Postmaster General, John Wanamaker. To Wanamaker, it may have looked like a kindness between old friends. To everyone else, it looked like exactly what it was: a very rich man in the cabinet handing the president's family a house. President Harrison, stung by the mockery, eventually sent a check to cover the cost. But it came late, and by then the newspapers had already had their fun. The cottage by the sea became one more reason to laugh at the Harrisons and at the dry goods man who had bought his way into their circle. I find this the strangest stretch of his whole life. Here was a man who could buy almost anything he set his eye on, and yet, over and over, he kept losing at the one game his money was supposed to win for him. The ridicule did not stop at the cottage. As postmaster, Wanamaker ordered a new run of postage stamps, and the press tore them apart, calling them the ugliest and cheapest the country had ever printed. Then came the oddest episode of them all. His own department store had ordered advance copies of a new translation of a novel by Leo Tolstoy, The Kreutzer Sonata. The order came in late, and the publisher gave Wanamaker only the ordinary discount, not the better early terms he had counted on. Wanamaker was furious, and he happened, just then, to be the man in charge of the United States mail, so he banned the book. He declared Tolstoy's novel obscene and barred it from the post. And once more, he was the punchline. A cabinet officer, using the power of his office to settle a grudge over a bookstore order. These were embarrassments. What came next cut deeper. Wanamaker did not only want power handed to him, he wanted to be elected to it, to stand in front of the voters and be chosen, and to wash off for good the charge that he had only ever bought his way in. Standing in his way was a man named Matthew Quay. Quay was the boss of the Republican machine in Pennsylvania, a United States senator who ran the state like a private firm. Years earlier, the two men had worked the same side, and it was partly Wanamaker's money that had helped the machine win. But by the middle of the 1890s, they were enemies. Quay could see that Wanamaker, if he ever took real power in the state, would pull the machine down around him. In 1896, Wanamaker went after a seat in the United States Senate. In those days, a senator was not chosen by the voters, but by the state legislature, and the legislature answered to Quay. Wanamaker campaigned all the same, denouncing the machine up and down Pennsylvania. Then his own campaign manager was accused of buying votes. The charge was later shown to be false, but the timing was perfect, and the harm was done. When the legislators met, they handed the seat to Quay's man, Boys Penrose. The one who beat him had himself nearly been driven out of an earlier race by a scandal of his own. It made no difference. Penrose had the machine, and the machine had the votes. 2 years later, Wanamaker tried once more, this time for governor. He crossed the state giving speech after speech, well over 100 of them, all aimed at a single target he named Quayism, the slow rot of boss rule. The crowds listened, but when the party picked its candidate, it picked Kay's man again, a congressman named William Stone, and Wanamaker went down a second time. His crusade did leave a mark. He had stirred up so much public anger at the boss that when Key's seat came up again in 1899, enough lawmakers turned against him to deny him the majority he needed, and it sat empty. Quay was even arrested on corruption charges of his own. Wanamaker went so far as to ask his old patron, the former President Harrison, to help keep the senator out. He landed real blows, but Key, bruised, would claw his way back in time, and Wanamaker never did win the office he was after. That was the lesson of his political years, and for a man like him it was a bitter one. His money had opened the door to the cabinet. It could not open the door to an honest election, and it could not buy back his good name once the papers had decided to make a fool of him. Worn out by the whole business, Wanamaker turned away from politics and back toward the one kingdom where his word was still law, his stores. And there, he set out to build himself a monument that no machine and no election could ever take from him. The Cathedral of Commerce. For 9 years, John Wanamaker ran a working department store inside a building site. He had decided that the old Grand Depot, the converted train shed that had first made his name, was no longer enough for him. He wanted something far larger standing in its place, built of stone this time, and meant to last for centuries. And he would not close the doors for even a single season to do it. So the new store rose in pieces. Section by section, the old building came down and the new one climbed up in the same ground. All the while, shoppers went on buying their gloves and their groceries a few yards from the dust and the cranes. It was a slow and costly way to build. But it suited a man who had spent his life refusing to choose between two things when he was sure he could have both. For the design, Wanamaker went to the biggest name in American architecture. Daniel Burnham of Chicago had built the shining white city of the World's Fair of 1893. It drew millions of visitors, and it fixed in the public mind a vision of what a modern American city might be. He had shaped great railroad stations and some of the first tall towers in the land. His standing advice to other builders was to make no little plans, and Wanamaker, who never had in his life, knew he had found the right partner. The Philadelphia store would be among the last great works Burnham finished before his death. What the two of them raised and completed in 1911 filled an entire city block. It stood directly across from Philadelphia's City Hall, with its statue of William Penn on top. Here was a merchant's store set down face to face with the seat of the city's government, and holding its own. 12 stories of granite, modeled on the stone palaces of Renaissance Italy, heavy and rooted in a way no store had ever tried to be. From the street, it looked less like a place to buy a hat than like a courthouse, or a bank built to outlast the century. That permanence was the whole idea. After years of losing to machine men like Key, after all the public mockery, Wanamaker had set out to build something that no rival and no election could ever take away from him. You cannot vote down a wall of marble. He meant this building to be standing and to be his, long after every man who had ever laughed at him was gone. But the true reason for all of it waited inside. At the heart of the building, Burnham had carved out a single enormous court, open through the full height of the floors and faced from the ground up in pale marble. They called it the Grand Court. A shopper stepping in from the racket of Market Street found herself all at once inside a vast and echoing room. She gazed up past gallery upon gallery of stone, toward a ceiling far overhead, with the light falling from above the way it falls in a cathedral. People lowered their voices without quite knowing why. It did not feel like a store. It felt like a place where you were expected to behave. That was exactly the effect Wanamaker wanted. He had spent his life half in the world of trade and half in the world of the church, and in this one building he tried to weld the two together. He believed, somewhere deep in himself, that the selling of honest goods at a fair price was its own form of moral work, and he wanted walls that would say as much. So he made the place as much a house of culture as a house of business. He hung real paintings in its galleries and threw open free exhibitions of art. A tired clerk or a washerwoman who would never be admitted to a private collection could stand and study fine pictures for nothing at all. The marble was never only there to impress. It was there to raise the plain daily act of buying and selling into something that felt almost like reverence. On the 30th of December 1911, the new store was formally dedicated, and the man who came to dedicate it was the President of the United States. William Howard Taft stood beneath those marble galleries and praised what Wanamaker had made. Consider for a moment what that scene must have meant to him. The man who could never win a single election now had a sitting president climbing his steps to bless his store. I do not think the irony was lost on him. And yet, for all its marble and all its height, the great court was still missing one thing. It stood silent. Wanamaker had built a room that felt far more like a church than a shop, and a church is never finished without music. To give his temple a voice, he would go searching for the largest instrument that human hands had ever built. The organ and the eagle. The instrument Wanamaker wanted already existed. The problem was that almost no one else could afford to want it. It had been built for a World's Fair. In 1904, the city of St. Louis hosted a great exposition, and for its concert hall, someone set out to build the most powerful pipe organ the world had ever heard. It was meant to be the largest ever made, big enough to move the air in a hall that held thousands. The ambition was enormous, and so was the bill. The costs ran far past every estimate, and the California firm that took on the work was ruined by it, broken before the thing was even finished. When the fair closed, the organ had nowhere to go. A hall in Kansas City was supposed to take it and backed out. So the largest instrument of its kind ever made was crated up and left to sit in a St. Louis warehouse. Think of it, a genuine wonder of its age, a masterpiece of engineering, packed into the dark because it was too big and too costly for anyone to use. That is where John Wanamaker found it. In 1909, he bought the whole thing, mostly unseen, and had it shipped east to Philadelphia. It took 13 freight cars to carry it across the country, and I will admit that picture delights me more than it probably should. 13 boxcars of the world's largest musical instrument, rolling toward a department store. Once it arrived, it took his workmen the better part of 2 years just to piece it back together inside the Grand Court. It sounded for the first time on the 22nd of June, 1911. By pure chance, that was the very day a new king, George V, was being crowned across the ocean in London. An ocean apart, on the same morning, two great rooms found their voice. A coronation filled Westminster Abbey with music. In Philadelphia, a marble court filled with sound at last, from an organ that had stood silent for 7 years. And here Wanamaker did the thing that turned a curiosity into a legend. The organ, vast as it was, could not quite fill the enormous court. The marble simply swallowed the sound. So he did what only he would think to do. He built an organ factory inside his own store, up in the higher floors, and he kept it running. His craftsmen added rank after rank of pipes, thousands of them, then thousands more, year after year. That workshop never really closed. For decades, a working organ factory hummed away above the sales floors, the only one of its kind in the world, slowly feeding the giant below, until no organ anywhere could rival it. It is still the largest of its kind that actually plays. He furnished the court with one more piece of the same fare. From St. Louis he also brought home a great bronze eagle, cast by a German sculptor, a heavy and watchful bird that he set down in the very center of the marble floor. He could not have guessed what it would become. Over the years that followed, the eagle turned into the meeting place of the whole city. When Philadelphians wanted to find one another in a crowd, they said 4 words, "Meet me at the Eagle." Couples met there for first dates. Mothers told lost children to wait beside it. The bird from the fair became the heart of the store. With the organ and the eagle in place, The Grand Court became something no other store could claim. It was a concert hall. The great conductor, Leopold Stokowski, brought the Philadelphia Orchestra to play beneath the marble galleries. Famous organists crossed oceans to perform on the instrument, and on one celebrated night a visiting French master sat down and improvised a work on the spot that organists still study today. And when the store opened its own radio station in the 1920s, the music of the court went out over the air into homes across the region. A family miles away could sit in their parlor and hear an organ playing inside a shop. Great music was suddenly free, a few steps from the ribbon counter. Wanamaker had built his temple and given it a voice that carried for blocks. He had made something he was sure would stand for centuries. But the years just ahead would test that certainty in the cruelest way. Because for all its marble and bronze, the world he had built was about to start burning. Everything burns. For all his talk of building for the ages, John Wanamaker's story is full of fire. He was certain that what he raised in stone and marble would outlast every man who had ever doubted him. I have come to think that certainty is the saddest thing about him. The empire did not stop at Philadelphia. In 1896, Wanamaker reached north into New York and bought himself a store on Broadway. And not just any store. He bought the Old Iron Palace, the cast-iron emporium of Alexander Stewart. Stewart had been the greatest merchant in America before the Civil War. He was the man who first showed a boy like Wanamaker that a store could be a kind of palace, and a shopkeeper a kind of king. To own that building was to stand, at last, in the place of his own hero. The student had bought the master's temple. He threw himself into New York the way he had thrown himself into Philadelphia. For a merchant from another city to plant his flag in Manhattan, the capital of American money, was a bold and very public thing to do. Wanamaker had always meant to be a national name rather than a local one, and now he was. A few years later he raised a tall new building beside the Old Iron Palace, and joined the two together with an ornate covered walkway high above the street. People called it the Bridge of Progress. In those years it seemed that nothing the man touched could fail. But fire does not care what a thing is worth. On a winter night in 1907, Wanamaker's country house caught fire and burned to the ground. It was a sprawling estate called Lindenhurst, north of the city. Inside hung the paintings and rare things he had gathered across a lifetime, a private gallery built by a man who had made beauty part of his trade. Some of those works he had loved for decades, and the loss was never only about money. By morning, all of it existed only in memory. A man can rebuild a house. He cannot rebuild 40 years of collecting, turned to ash between dusk and dawn. That same year brought a second blow. By one account, the great financial panic of 1907 came close to costing Wanamaker his entire fortune. He weathered it, as he weathered most things, and the stores stayed open. But the year had taught him something hard, and taught it twice. Everything he had built was, in the end, a wager against time, and time collects on every wager it is offered. The fires were not done with him. By the time the last one came, the whole world he had known was passing. The Gilded Age was over, and the great merchant princes were dying off, their downtown palaces beginning to look like relics of another century. This fire came decades after Wanamaker himself was in his grave, and it took the oldest piece of his whole empire, the very first store he had ever bought. By the 1950s, the New York store had lost its shoppers to the new suburbs, and in 1954, it closed for good. The Old Iron Palace, the one he had bought from Stewart, was sold off to be pulled down and replaced with apartments. But before the wreckers could finish, in July of 1956, the empty building caught fire. It became one of the worst blazes the city had ever seen. The old cast-iron palace put up a strange, stubborn fight, standing for hours as the flames roared through it. 600 firefighters battled the thing for 25 hours. They poured some 50 million gallons of water onto it. So much water that it flooded down into the subway tunnels below and shut the line for nearly a week. Officials feared the street itself might cave in. For days, the heart of one of the busiest cities on Earth was thrown into chaos by the slow death of a single old building. A newsreel crew filmed the whole thing, and the footage survives. You can watch the smoke pour over Lower Manhattan, rising from the bones of a palace older than the man who had once owned it. No one died. But when the fire was finally out, the building that Alexander Stewart had raised and John Wanamaker had bought was gone, and a piece of the 19th century went with it. The newer building beside it, the one Wanamaker had added himself, came through the fire and stands in New York to this day. There is a hard lesson tucked inside that about which things last and which do not. Wanamaker had wagered everything on stone, and stone, it turns out, is no safer a bet than anything else. But the truest thing he ever made was never stone at all. It was people. And to find it, we have to go back to the two sons he raised, and the strange and separate roads they each chose to walk. The sons of John Wanamaker had two sons, and between them they took his nature and pulled it in half. The elder, Thomas, got the head for money. He understood the figures and the financing of the stores better than anyone, his father included, and for a time he ran much of the business side. But Thomas had a streak in him that must have unsettled the old man. In 1899 he bought a Philadelphia newspaper, the North American. He filled its pages with the kind of writers his father would never have welcomed at his table, radicals and socialists of every stripe. Worse, in the eyes of a man who kept the Sabbath like iron, Thomas printed a Sunday edition. The devout father now had a son publishing a newspaper on the Lord's own day. But Thomas did not live to see how any of it ended. He died abroad in 1908, years before his father, and the family lost the one person who truly understood its money. The younger son, Rodman, got everything else. Where Thomas was numbers, Rodman was taste. He had gone to Princeton, lived for years in Paris, and come home with an eye for fine things and a hunger to fill the stores with them. It was Rodman, more than anyone, who gave the Wanamaker name its art and its air of French refinement. But the thing worth remembering about Rodman is not what he sold. It is what he chased. He chased greatness in unlikely places. In 1916, over a lunch in his own New York store, Rodman gathered a group of professional golfers, men who in those days were treated as hired help, barely a step above the caddies who carried the bags. Out of that lunch came the Professional Golfers Association of America, and Rodman put up the prize, a heavy silver cup. More than 100 years later, the best golfers alive still compete each year to lift the Wanamaker trophy. Few of them could tell you who he was. He chased the sky as well. Years before anyone had flown across the Atlantic, Rodman decided it could be done, and paid to find out. He hired the aviation pioneer Glenn Curtiss to build a flying boat, a huge winged machine called the America, meant to cross the ocean and claim a newspaper's prize. The war stopped the flight before it could happen, but the design was sound enough that the British Navy bought it to hunt submarines, and Rodman had helped shove aviation years further down the road. And then there was the strangest chase of all. Rodman became convinced that the native peoples of America were a dying race, doomed to vanish, and that someone had to record them before they were gone. So between 1908 and 1913, he paid for 3 expeditions across the West. He sent a photographer named Joseph Dixon to make thousands of images of Native American life, and published them in a book he called The Vanishing Race. He lobbied for Native Americans to be made full citizens, and he planned an enormous national monument to them, to stand in New York Harbor and rival the Statue of Liberty. This is the hardest piece of his life to weigh, and I am not sure any honest person settles it cleanly. Some of what Rodman did was genuinely decent. He spent his own fortune pressing for the citizenship that Native Americans were finally granted in 1924, but the whole effort rested on a falsehood. The idea that these were peoples already finished, fading images of a world that was ending, when in truth they were alive and would go on living. The pictures he paid for were lovely and staged, a comfortable story told to white Americans about a people they were busy pushing aside. The monument was never built. The ground was broken, and then it was quietly forgotten. While his sons chased after golf cups and vanishing worlds, John Wanamaker grew old. He died on the 12th of December 1922 at the age of 84, worth something close to $100 million. Then the city he had served all his life did a thing it had never quite done for a shopkeeper. Some 400,000 Philadelphians gave money, much of it in small coins, to raise a great bronze statue of him near City Hall. It stands there today, a few steps from his store. Rodman, the only son left, took the empire and ran it for 6 more years. Then, in 1928, he died too. And with that, the family that had made the Wanamaker name famous across America was, almost overnight, gone. The stores still stood, the organ still played, but the men who had dreamed them up were not coming back. The long question of what would outlive them was only beginning. What survives? The empire did not fall all at once. It faded. After Rodman died in 1928, the family's hold on the stores slowly loosened. The Wanamakers carried on for decades, but the world that had built them was quietly coming apart. The old downtown palaces of shopping were losing their crowds. They went first to the suburban malls and the parking lots, and later to the screen that everyone would come to carry in a pocket. In 1978, the family sold the business at last. After that, the Philadelphia store passed from one owner to the next, each a proud name in its day, bought up and sold on. In the end, it became a Macy's, one more outpost of a national chain, ringing up sales beneath the marble of a court that had been built for a king's ransom. And then, in the spring of 2025, even that came to an end. Macy's closed the doors of the old Wanamaker store for good. After almost 150 years, there was no longer a department store at 13th and Market in Philadelphia. It was the last of the old downtown stores in the city, the final trace of an age when a single store could be the center of a town's whole life. In the final days, crowds came to stand in the court one more time and hear the organ play. They listened, surrounded by half-empty shelves and the hush of a place winding down. Then the music stopped, and the lights went out. The great room fell silent. And here, at the very end, the story turns once more, because the people of Philadelphia would not let it all simply vanish. For 34 years, a small group of volunteers had kept the organ alive and playing, tending its thousands of pipes for the love of the thing. The organ, still the largest working instrument of its kind in the world, is protected by the city now, and cannot be ripped out. So is the bronze eagle, still standing watch in the middle of the floor. And when word went around that the Christmas light show might be lost, more than 1,000 ordinary people sent in their own money to save it. The show had been a fixture in that court since the 1950s. That winter, the lights came back on. The people, in the end, had refused to let the place die quietly. The building itself is being made into something new. A developer has begun turning the upper floors into hundreds of apartments, with shops on the levels below. The same developer has promised to bring the Grand Court back to the soaring room it was meant to be. People will sleep and wake where Wanamaker once sold pianos and wedding china. The work will take years, and the music may go quiet again while it happens. But the plan is for the organ and the eagle and the court to come through it all, and to belong this time not to a store, but to the city itself. For the first time in its long life, the great court will not be trying to sell anyone anything. It will simply be a room the city kept because it could not bear to lose it. Standing at the end of his story, what strikes me is not how much John Wanamaker built, but how little of it he managed to keep. The mansion burned, the New York palace burned, the fortune scattered, and the family faded. The stores slipped into other hands and, in the end, closed their doors. He had wagered everything on permanence, and permanence failed him at nearly every turn. It is a strange thing to give a whole life over to building, and to watch nearly all of it taken back by fire and time. And yet something of him did survive, just not the thing he had counted on, not the empire, and not, in the end, even the stores. What lasted was smaller than all of that and much harder to burn, It was the habit of a city meeting under a bronze bird, and the sound of an organ filling a room with more music than a room was ever meant to hold. Most of all, it was the stubborn love of strangers who fought to keep an old building, long after most of them had forgotten the name of the man who raised it. Carved into the stone of that building, Wanamaker had left a few words for whoever might come after him, asking them to go on building with honor and with truth. He had meant them for the clerks and shoppers of his own day. But the words outlasted the man, and they outlasted his company too. His name itself is half forgotten now, and still, each time the organ sounds again in that court, something the old merchant believed turns out to have been true. It plays now for the people who will soon live there, and for the strangers who wander in. The marble did not last because it was marble. It lasted because the people who loved it decided that it should.